My name's Glyn Pooley, and I'd like to talk about art. This time, my subject is
Monet, 1814, 1926. Let's go back to some of his, well, let's start with an early painting. Most of us know that Monet is one of the main Impressionist painters. He was a forerunner of Impressionism, and he gathered a number of other painters around him. But those painters kind of evolved over a number of years, that he met at a variety of schools in Paris as he developed his education. He was born and brought up in Le Havre, Normandy. His father was quite a wealthy merchant, a chandelier. Unfortunately, his mum passed when he was 16, but he was brought up by an aunt and then his father, and they supported him. His mum supported him, as did his aunt. His dad didn't, which is often the case with these artists. So, but because he went to the art school, he showed an early talent, and they sent him to a quite prodigious school called Académie Suisse, where he met people like Renoir and later Sisley and Pissarro. And he was studying under a couple of quite famous traditional French artists like Baudin. And Baudin was one of the first, he was a marine artist, but one of the first artists to go outdoors, which is what made a big difference to Monet. So, they were, most of these painters, mid 1900s, were trained in a traditional way, but because of developments in materials, I think some of us know this, the development portable tubes and all this kind of thing, there started to be more of a movement to be able to go out and paint outside more easily. So Monet was at the forefront of that with Bourdin's tuition. So you get an early example here of a more traditional kind of way of painting. What I mean by that, you can see that, for example, the sky and everything is quite smoothly blended. There's no obvious brush marks, one laid on top of the other, side by side, which becomes a traditional Impressionist motif as he kind of develops. But what we see him really interested in here is capturing light effects. And the only way he felt they could really do that was to go out and paint in the landscape. And he worked with a number of those other Impressionist painters and people like John Singer Sargent as well, the American painter, who was another fantastic artist. So they all kind of learned from each other, developed this language with each other. But most people were impressed by Monet's ability to capture light and atmosphere, and his swiftness as well. As a young man, he also made caricatures for his friends and families. Actually sold quite a few, made a little bit of money on the side, which was, part of his draftsmanship ability. But as we see in this one, we can see this, as I said, beautiful light, beautiful atmosphere, and a contemplative kind of perspective here. You just see that this little figure sat on the riverbank, just enjoying the natural environment. Riverbanks and water will feature very highly later on in Monet's work. And he's starting to develop a broken mark, as you can see, within the grass there. And it starts to become a little bit more obvious that he's after this almost like speckled fleck effect. But he's still using primarily traditional tones to get that. Nature and the gardens become, of course, another big feature in his work. Gardens and his relationship with the people who are in his community, a close community, often his family members. I suppose you could say he was part of a bourgeoisie set, so the family were ready models for him. Paints a number of pictures, including his wife and his son. A number of Impressionists do that as well. but he just uses them as a motif within the landscape. And in Monet's work, as he goes on later, it's quite a developed landscape or controlled landscape, which, as I said, focuses around gardens. But to get there, he has to progress through a few stages. And in this Normandy picture, whereby he is looking at this very fashionable group of artworks, which a number of the painters of this time were particularly intrigued by, and that was Japanese woodcut prints, whereby people like Hokusai, who was famous for his wave picture, would create these images almost like stage sets, but on certain picture planes, moving from the foreground through the mid and into the distance, and tell stories on each of these planes or these layering up. So in this case, you get a kind of strange combination of what looks like a naturalistic garden in front with perspective, and then as we move into the sea area, that perspective's completely changed. It's got two-dimensional, so he's mixing three-dimensional points or naturalistic ways of painting with this two-dimensional, almost abstract way of painting. And, again, these artists were interested in these multi-layers because they're moving towards this direction where they're trying to perceive how, as they moved into the modern life and things started to speed up a lot, they could overlay more and more information. So we see it quite often in Monet. We take in a whole scene and you have figures in it, and it looks all relatively naturalistic until we really study it. And then we notice that the figures are slightly off or too big or too small or just used for this other purpose. And this other purpose is related to the Japanese woodcut print. So here we've got a picture, and we start to move towards a mid-zone where this middle group of people are, and then from there forward we're into the foreground. And as we come through the foreground, you see the marks start to get larger and larger. So like you see this in the water. They're placed in a direction which represents the water, so primarily horizontal. But as we get closer, you see they start to become like these zigzag lines. Okay, so we analyze the way those zigzag lines work with on the flat picture plane, and this gives the illusion of water. But to also give the idea of he's looking out onto this scene and there's a lot of movement going on in the water. If you have a look at this center boat here, you can see that it's almost as if he's double painted it. So you can see the exterior shape of it, like see the shape of that boat on the left hand side, and the same for this one on the center. But you can also see that there's another line drawn just above it. So this is to sort of suggest that this boat in front of him is bobbing up and down on the water. So he's trying to capture two simultaneous points. Quite sophisticated ways of thinking with art at this particular time, but only really being achieved because they're actually out there and they're really observing very clearly what's is going on in front of their eyes. And Monet was often described as a very visual painter in terms of he described him as an amazing eye, but what an eye was the exclamation which came with it. So this real looking, deep, intense looking and capturing what was around in front of him while being outside was something that so impressed his contemporaries. So all kinds of atmospheric effects were one of the things that Monet was particularly interested in. So we've seen some, images of being painted in the summer, and now we're seeing effects and changes that are happening before his eyes. It's interesting with snow, as we looked at last week, that in its shadow area, everything is predominantly of the blue end of the scale spectrum, but the reflections, of course, as well, are much more towards the blue aspect. And when you just contrast that with a little bit of warmth, like he's got in the building in the background there, still a very cool reds. That's what gives us the overall effect. So there's not many colours being used here. It's a very limited palette still, but they're really well balanced. And now 1870, we start to see the impressionist kind of mark appearing more so. So here he is documenting family together. That's his wife on the left hand side. That's a friend of the artist, one of his artist friend's wife. And we're seeing quite expressionistic, we could argue now, marks here. So these white marks in the foreground, for example, we can clearly see that how they've been applied to that paint, to that surface. There's no hidden, there's no smoothing away or anything like that. They are quite expressionistic even, but he's using, again, very accurate tones to create lovely forms and shadows. There's this beautiful blue under the parasol there of a certain tone, dark enough to suggest a shadow, but also within the tonal range of the blue greys to link everything together. If you look at his wife's hat on the left hand side, the hat might have been showing quite brilliant colours in reality, but you see how he's mixed in this blue grey into all those colours on her hat to link them up. So there's a colour harmony. So it's a blue grey red, blue grey yellow, blue etc. and green. So again, he's still using them and mixing paint from local colour to enable the whole thing just to be bound together strongly. And then we have this picture, which is the first painting where we step into what became known as Impressionism. Impressionism came about in an exhibition in 1874 when the artists got together, a number of these artists, including Renoir and, as I say, Pissarro. They couldn't really get shown in the academy, the salon. It was really quite tricky because they were not interested in the main big history and genre paintings. They said they were more interested now in starting to portray modern life. So you have a dock scene in Le Havre here. These sort of this would have been seen as a kind of sketch, more so in the academic tradition. Whereas, of course, the Impressionists wanted to say, well, no, they're not a sketch. They're a clear analysis of impressions that we are feeling and seeing in our eyes when we're in front of these kind of pictures. Now, these were seen as very radical at the time. It sounds daft to us because they look pretty innocuous, but they have stood the test of time, as we know. So there was at this time also a French chemist called Cheverel who was working on all kinds of color theories, particularly the theories of complementary colors, now colors mix in the eye and things like that. So people like Renoir and of course Monet, they take these theories and they try to implement them. So for example, putting a blue color next to an orange starts to make the color vibrate, as you can see in this piece, and that creates that amazing shimmer. So rather than what traditionally maybe the paint would have been put on in a blended way, they put the mark next to each other. So in this case, on top of itself, so the orange reflection there is put on top of that pale blue, and you can see where those marks have been put on with opaque paint. And we also see all these marks in evidence, like in the foreground with these blues hinting towards these browny grey colours there. And the action of putting those marks on in the viewer creates a kind of energy in the picture, as does in the sky there. Okay, you could read it as an unfinished quality, but you could also see it as an expressionistic kind of quality. At the top of the sky, you've got those lovely golden yellows, which then come down into this pink, orangey red, and it still all vibrates with this. So from ridicule and it took quite a few years before the art market kind of picked up on it. But there were a couple of patrons did start to appear. So here we have a picture of Monet's wife again, looking rather sad, bless her, because she apparently just lost her dad. But so there's a kind of psychological part of the portrait there. But again, his emphasis and his interest is this is almost like the old and the new. You've got in the bottom right hand corner, this half is like more traditional, and then on the left you've got the shimmering light of the more modern, higher palette, higher tonal palette, impressionist, what became traditional impressionism, which you see in the background there, and we see the difference with how the paint dances in these two different kinds of ways. In the background, you've got the complementaries of the orange and the blues. You also got yellows, things going towards yellows and hints of purples, but with that broken mark. And then on the right hand side, you've got the more traditional tones, slightly more expressionistic handling of them now. And it's interesting to see that push-pull effect going on between the two areas. The one thing I found particularly intriguing in this picture was the picture of Madame Camille Monet was her left hand here. As you see it, you follow it round and then up to a white glove, and it looks as if she's almost like holding a stick or something like that. Because her hand is just up to a point, but then you follow that stick down, and it doesn't kind of read as a stick entirely. It almost reads as the support for the bench because there's cross members to it. So I thought that's a little bit intriguing. So there's an element of a kind of undoneness to these pictures. Monet is master at that suggestion rather than clear definition, and that takes a lot of practice to be able to get the right tone, just to leave enough out so that the viewer can do some work in a picture and then be more actively engaged in that process. And here, quite a famous picture of the promenade of his wife and son. This is interesting, of course, because it's also a painting of time passing. We've got a picture of his wife and son starting on the top left-hand corner here, and he's also painted them as they walk through all the lovely poppy fields, and they've walked and end up being on the right-hand side. This is again back to the Japanese woodcut issue theories, where they multiple time and space and multiple imagery to enter into these other worlds, but also gets closer to our real experience of life. Very rarely, if we made a portrait of someone in the field, would they just stand in one point for any length of time, uninstigated, that is, unless we told them to. There's a fair chance that they'd walk across our field and explore another aspect of it. So he's working on that kind of theme. So all these things create extra interest to it in the picture. And it's interesting looking at the little figures on the right hand side here as well. I mentioned undoneness or suggestions, and that's what you get with these figures. You can there's hardly anything laid out there for the lady's face. And again, the shape of the parasol is very simple. And when we look at his portrayal of the figure and the body as it comes down to it amongst the grass, there's no feet or legs or anything like that. It's just blending away, slowly seeping away into the upright marks of the soft grasses. So, we have to train our eye as artists to be able to edit information away in that particular way and really analyze what the tonal relationships. And it's very difficult to do that accurately for nature unless you actually go out into it, because the light is so transient, of course, and so specific as well. And Monet really struggled with this as well. So if he struggles with it, we'll all struggle. But the clue is in the nature when you're out there. Monet tackles it by repainting a picture over and over and over. We'll have a look in a second. In a whole series of paintings at different times of day and times of year. So his fascination in water, so much so, he buys a studio boat so he can spend more time on the water, studying reflections. So there's a nice picture of his boat here. And these kinds of mark making process starting to become clearly in evidence here, isn't it? This broken, shimmering mark for the background in the trees here. And as he moves forward, we got some denser, darker tones, and then we look at the way that the marks have been laid to suggest the water. These simple little zigzag tones again, and they're enough for us to be engaged with it, with the picture. Sometimes when we're making our artwork and we're learning, of course, we tend to put too much in. That's nearly always the case. Almost trying to make a picture that's nearly finished is much harder than what we generally perceive as a completed picture. It's a good practice to try and just engage with a sense of looseness and suggestion and seeing how little we can actually put in a painting for it to still tell us what we need to know and what we want the viewer to see. That's another real good thing about painting outdoors, because often the weather's we're at the vagaries of the weather, etc. So we haven't got the time to be so precious and pedantic to finish things off to levels of detail before the rain might come in or the clouds are passed over. So it makes us work a little bit more quickly. And that's another part of the process that Monet engaged with. He moved from earlier pictures, which, as we saw, quite considered and designed, to a different mental way of perceiving how he put paint on. He said, I want to start painting like birds fly, like nature is. And so it's almost becoming a one with the landscape. And the almost letting the landscape kind of seep right in through your retina and then out onto your canvas. And a fluidity of mark is one way of achieving that. If you can combine it with the right tonal relationships and the suggestion of undoneness, we could say, then you get these exciting paintings. Here we are, Argentine. I think it's northwest Paris. Lovely light he's managed to capture here, and lovely treatment of the clouds. Starting off in the background there, where we see suggestions of their soft edge shapes, and as we move forward again, flat areas in the distance, and as we move forward, they get more and more mark orientated. But what gives this picture its real zip is this wonderful orange yellow through the center of the masts, contrasting to the blue reflections in the water again. So the structure is quite complex if we follow it across, often if we were making a picture of a boat, a scene like this, we probably wouldn't think to put a mast right in the center, right in the foreground of the picture, not in the center. It's a third on the left hand side, of course, because we know things work well in thirds. But it's cutting through the picture plane right in the center there, and then it's repeated in that central mast. So by repeating something, you create a movement from one space to another or one place to another. And then we look at the directions of the mast, they're slightly going up from right to left or left to right in a diagonal. So again, echoing energy and rhythm in the picture. So if you imagine if you put a piece of tracing paper over this and just drew its outline and just look to see the structure of it, you see these wonderful kinds of ways the artist has moved us from left to right and then up and down. So compositionally, that's all been achieved. And then he's using this more modern technology, as we say, mixing the complementary colours of the blues and yellow oranges to zip up all the sparkling quality, and that's then reinforced by the repeated marks and that feeling of the sensitivity of the marks that he's building up one on top of the other. So this is a beautiful study and painting of sunlight, of course, isn't it? The way the light comes through through the softness of his wife's dress and hits the side of her dress, and then he's looking directly into the sun here, which is a very difficult way of painting, of course. And I think some of us know that Monet did really struggle with his eyesight, particularly later on. He would have been all right these days because it was cataracts, but in those days that was still, very early pioneering technology to overcome. But this was because probably he spent a lot of time staring and really, really looking into the lights to try and get to grips with the nuance of these lighting effects as they were happening. So he's looking into this scene, and we're getting this very interesting interpretation of the clouds in the background. They're like little abstract marks, aren't they? We know they're clouds. They've got a perspective to them, but they're little dabs and flicks and flashes of paint which kind of suggest they are moving. They suggest it's a windy day as well. So atmosphere is being incorporated and interpreted and shared, as in a way he's painted the grasses, the midground here. They're not straight up verticals, they're going off to the left there with these tiny little marks. So again it's wind blowing, etc. And then this blue shadow as it comes towards us in the foreground, giving this sense of space and leading us as a tool up to the main figure again that has got blues and yellow oranges in there as well. I suppose a number of you probably have been to Paris and seen some of these impressionist paintings. And when you're in front of them, there's a great collection of them in the Musée d'Orsay, which used to be an old railway station. And when you're in front of them, you are struck by the amazing radiance of the colours and how that kind of does vibrate with your own retina when you're looking at them. Because they put on with these, as I said, these new tubes, and they put them on fresh. And often he would paint these in one sitting to try and capture these effects. The paint hasn't deteriorated by overblending or anything like that, so the purity is still there. Oh, this is an interesting one. Of course, I mentioned this fashion for Japanese painting, which was there. So this is a perfect example of his wife dressed in a kimono. This also is almost a forerunner to Van Gogh's pictures, isn't it? He was particularly intrigued by this kind of flattening of the picture plane, the decorative quality of the picture plane, but also the otherworldliness of these Japanese pictures. So for Monet, it's the otherworldliness which is the slight emphasis for him here. He's very, gifted in terms of being able to capture a sense of reality. Like you really get a sense of weight on that kimono, particularly at the base of it there. But his passion for decoration and color and form is also coming through it. And then the abstract quality of all these fans in the background, just entering into this other magical and mystical world, really. So these things are there in Monet as well. They're not overtly main part of his opera, but they are there, and I think it's because of it his work has, reached so many people and continues to. Also, the Impressionists were known as painters that wanted to paint modern life. So they went out into the city, and as well as the parks, we saw an image in the park. They painted, steam trains, the energy and the vitality of stations and steam and things like this. They were something which they found captivating, and for Monet, it was the transience of the steam effects that were happening in these particular places. How light at certain times of day are connected with the steam, and creates these melodies, if you like, in blue in this case. So one of the painters that Monet friended with and connected with was Whistler as well. So some of you might have known some of Whistler's work when he painted in London, because Monet came over to London on a number of occasions. The main time he came over, the first main time, was to escape the Franco-Prussian War. He didn't want to be conscripted again. He'd been conscripted into the Algerian War for a year, and then he was invalided out. So the family moved to London, and of course he met people like Whistler then, who was interested in tonalism and so melodies in blue and things like that. And you can see it. You can see that kind of influence here, looking at these certain lighting effects and how we can kind of create that atmosphere with relatively few colours, but with shimmering marks. And he did Monet painted a whole series. He started to work in series more and more. He painted a whole series of these stations. This is quite a famous one, La Gare Saint-Lazare. And we get this wonderful light coming through into the station here, multiplied by the atmospheric effect of steam in that particular place. The shimmer is there, but the golden glow is also very much in evidence. And what a fantastic example, editing away information so the necessary can speak. When we gaze into the background, marks become incredibly soft and delicately suggested, but we can still see, say for example, on the left-hand side, the suggestion of the Haussmann architecture, which of course Paris was famous for. Just coming, and the sunlight is just hitting it in the distance, and just enough is being revealed for us then to use our imagination to think of the boulevard going off for miles in the background. And these kinds of things are what make these pictures particularly special. Our level of engagement in them is just enough. There's just enough information for us to be able to step into it, and then let our imaginations kind of fill in a lot of the rest that's going on in them. Again, another way of just stepping into a different kind of tonal range of colours. Wonderful light, soft golden light in the background here. I love the way these little boats, these are steamboats on the river there, how he's painted the steam coming out of their funnels. It's like a little wiggly woggly line in the background. Excuse me, just the right tone and right kind of shape, almost like a child would do it, but just enough, just suggesting, just holding it in there for us to then piece the jigsaw puzzle together. And then as he moves further forward, the colours get more and more saturated. The green becomes stronger. But what a wonderful rich green it is. And you can see that's enhanced as we come further forward by these red qualities. Just red is just creeping through here and there. These complementaries, as I said, things we take for granted now, which lift a painting and lift a colour relationship. They're just ever so subtle. So reds, greens, as you say, this beautiful blue colour set on a kind of golden ochre in the background. All great ways of picture making in an economical way. So if we can just try and register some of these things that he's implementing here, we might be able to incorporate it into our own pictures. Often we're using our pictures as source material, things like photographs, which are very clearly defined and pinned down. We've said this a number of times, particularly digital imagery. And look at the difference from that kind of imagery to this suggestive imagery. And let's use this, looking at this as a way of understanding how he's translating what the eye is seeing. Sketch, you might be able to go and sit in your car for 5 minutes somewhere and just with a little watercolor or something, just put a few marks down. You don't have to put many, but just try and put a few accurate marks and tones that you see with your eye through the windows. And then that becomes the starting point for a picture. At least it's a strong analysis, and it takes us away from incredible dependency on photography, digital photography, and secondhand information like that. So when we're in front of these pictures, we get to kind of analyze these wonderful things. Another theme that he painted was the sea and the light reflecting on these particular rocks. You would pick a specific rock, of course, and then go and paint it at different times of day and at different seasons in the year. It's an incredible interest that he was so excited by these lighting effects, which I know we could say for them it was new. Of course it was, because you know they didn't even have, well, they had black and white photography, if you like, um, but they were still excited and they were still sensitive to these wonderful vibrations of color and light and their specific qualities. Well, we still can be today, and they are there available for us if we can work out this kind of subject matter that we really love, each of us, and the shorthand of being able to paint them with this level of vibrancy, because it'll be encouraging then. So, really think about these different uh, this language which he's using as we explain this, as we move through it. Now, one of his series themes, which was quite extensive, shall we say, 1890 to 91, it was a haystack stack series, and I think he painted 25 of these. They're monumental pieces, 3 or 4 foot across, 3 foot down, things like that. Painted early on in the morning, late morning, afternoon, evening, winter, spring, summer, and autumn. It's a simple motif, relatively simple, but the light hits these objects in such a way that there's a whole nuance of colors which come from them. And so in this case, of course, you can see this wonderful light, early morning light of this lemon yellow, and then the distance cool of the blues and the muted greens. And as we move forward, we move into just the warming up, the red towards the haystack. Underneath it, we got this wonderful reflected blue of the sky. Again, early morning dew, just sitting on a surface, and the broken mark of the green of the grass, but not complicated, not complex in terms of the structure of the image, because you could spend more time really analysing the lights and the lighting effect on it. Though saying that, to challenge himself, he also did quite a complex picture, which I'll show you in a minute. So this is an example of the haystacks at different times of the year and the day, of course. And it's incredible, isn't it? So if you're ever short of a motif, or what do I paint this week, you could just pick one subject that you're particularly interested in. For example, for me, I really like painting the watchtower in Dunnet. People know that. I must have painted 25 times at least. It's a simple subject, but it's always and forever changing. And the way the light hits it is very different in the summer as it is in the winter, whether it be a low light or a high light. In that case, in the watchtower, it's got water around it as well, so that shimmer and reflects. But for you, pick your particular subject and go back to it. Don't be afraid. Don't say, oh, well, I painted it now. That's enough. I won't look at it again. Revisit it at a different time of day or a different time of the year, and just do it. Experiment with it differently. Each time you go back to it, you learn something more from it. It's a great way of learning about different aspects of painting. Every time we go to a new subject, our brain has to take in a whole new host of information. If we get really familiar with a particular subject, then we can look at different aspects of it. So I think this is what Monet was after. So as well as the haystacks and his series of train stations and things like that, he also did the facade at Rouen Cathedral, which is very complex. It would have been a very complex if you'd taken a black and white photograph of that. You'd see all the little nuance and details of the architecture. You see all the sculptural qualities and everything, but he's pared all that down. he's got this amazing shorthand where he's very accurate in terms of the architecture, the shapes, etc. But his interests, as you can see here, are about how the light hits it, how the light changes it. And look how much it transforms it from a morning light to a sunset. Phenomenal, really, isn't it? And each day we're exposed to all these changes around us. So, as I said, if you ever stop for a subject, look out your window. It could just be a bird table in your garden. Try and paint it in the morning, paint it in the afternoon, in the evening. You'll be amazed how different and how transformed it is just by those different light effects on it. So yeah, we visited the subject. I'm trying sometimes just work in these series. This is another theme they particularly loved, of course, later on, is trees, nature, gardens, and the River Seine, where his famous garden of Giverny was next to. Yeah. And you kind of engage with these different aspects. Nature ever changing, but he had to find a way, because it ever changing, fleeting, of controlling it to some degree. So he, as you know, some of you probably have been over to Giverny. I wonder if I got that. Oh, we'll get to that in a second then. So in this picture, you've got these amazing poplars at the River Ept, and they're kind of iconic because they are an iconic French tree because they're grown in all around the countryside there. But he's making more iconic because he's kind of, as well as his loose treatment of the sky, he's set this swirling diagonal elevational quality of the way the trees form into this zigzag. And he does that a number of times when he paints poplars as well, which creates an increase in energy in them, which gives an impression of their sheer magnitude. They are a big tree, if anyone's been in front of them, and they are wonderful and they are magnificent. So to be able to kind of have this zigzag diagonal, which of course is a very strong force, that gives us that extra strength of feeling towards nature. And he paints them in a series of different colours again. I mentioned earlier about his trip to London, 1870, so just after 1870s, where he was living there. He also goes back, and one of the main reasons is because of his art dealer, Duron Rule, opens up a place in London. London has got a lot of money at the beginning of the 20th century, well, the elite have, because the empire is still going, etc., etc. So he opens up this gallery, and Monet is one of the star attractions there. So they commission him to paint a number of his series of specific things in London. And one of them is Charing Cross Bridge. Another one is the Houses of Parliament, for example. And I think he paints something like 20 in a series of these, again capturing these different light qualities. Now, London at that particular time was known as a pretty dirty place, but it was known for its fog, mists, fog, pollution, call it what you will. But they did create some amazing light effects on the Thames. And Monet loved that. Monet loved those nuances of subtle colours reflecting sky, light reflecting on water, and he captures them beautifully. So simple little picture, just a bridge shape, again echoing of the Japanese woodcut print, but wonderful lights, prismatic quality of the golden ochres, the purples, the blues, all those kinds of marks again. We're lucky if you're interested in Monet, of course, because you can go in. You're only going to pop it down the road into the Cardiff Museum, because the Davis sisters were collecting at the right time for Impressionist work, and they collected a whole number of them. And there's a number of Monets in there, including works of the Houses of Parliament and things like that. This is an example of it, with the sunlight just coming through a gap in the clouds with this golden warm quality, and then the light is shimmering down onto the wonderful water there, and the Houses of Parliament in this amazing blue colour recedes into the background, but it's enough structure to complement the lovely golden ochres again, and we get this sense of the mist and the fog just kind of being in that particular place, and we get lost. There's almost like a mystical, magical quality to this way of painting. He becomes totally absorbed in this aspect of light. Of course, when he's in London, one of the people you can never escape from, of course, is Turner. And Turner specialised in capturing atmospheric aspects of light. So Monet was in his element there in terms of that connection. But for Monet, it's capturing them in these wonderful prismatic complementary colours, which has been so attractive for so many years now. You can imagine going to Venice for him when he went to Venice, another perfect place, a building and water and light and reflection, architecture, which is crumbly. He liked a bit of a crumbly architecture because it suited his brush mark. His brush mark, that broken brush mark, that textured brush mark, is what gives these paintings that amazing quality. It's it's deceptively, it looks relatively simple, but it's not easy to achieve. You've just got to really look and really build one layer on top of another layer. So you can see how if you want to learn and have a go at a version like this using Monet as an example on this picture, this could be, for example, you could paint it roughly out in watercolor, for example, with the main kinds of shapes. And then you could use color pencil over the top of it and just put a layer of color pencil over it with just little marks, but putting them in the right direction, these directional marks. And then I would suggest using, say, for example, gouache and watercolor over the top of that. So you'd have like a little painting sandwich. So the undercolor would just slowly start to come through in places, but the marks would be placed side by side on each other, next to each other. So at least you'd have substance in your materials to create a certain kind of shimmer. What you don't want is a flat uniformity, even if it's a broken mark. You don't want it all to be equal. You need different layers to it as well to build that up. So that's a particular way of achieving something like this. Wonderful use of purples and yellows for complementaries, etc. But looking and analysing light on water and old crumbly buildings. So that's another theme. If you're interested in Monet, you can go and look out for those kinds of things. And we get there locally. We got them in Cardiff, we got the River Taff. We've got buildings, we sometimes have tremendous light in Cardiff and even in Barry, but architecturally there's some interesting buildings of this kind of ilk, early 20th century, etc., in Cardiff that could be, adapted and used as an example for this kind of way of painting. Oh wow! Over there in Venice, this painting I think is in Cardiff as well. Thinking about it, but you can see the clear evidence of the brush marks here, the crisscross marks layering one over the top of the other, creating these amazing shimmering effects. Very strong coloration here. It's not quite as vibrant as this image is on the screen, but gives you, in reality, it's more subtle. But you still get to see these wonderful purples coming through, and the blues and the yellows, and the soft, as I keep saying, the shimmering quality of putting the marks one on top of the other and next and side by side, so they all kind of vibrate over the surface. Again, a relatively simple motif. Editing away information is just the key. It's so important. We're so often just attracted to detail. So he's taken the main building here and just used it as a silhouette. And then that enables him then to just play with the colours and the colour relationships on it. This is a picture of Monet, 1899. When was he born? 1840. So he's 59 there. This is just before he goes on into his quite long final period of his career, whereby he really gets fascinated by his garden at Giverny. And First time in life he was selling enough artwork to be able to purchase a little place and a garden. And then his work became more and more successful. And as it did, he just extended the garden bigger and bigger, even diverted the river to enable him to be able to capture all these wonderful lighting effects and things he became famous for. And it's one of the motifs which he became particularly famous for, as you can see in the foreground there, are his water lilies and the bridges, Japanese bridges, even there. But he created a controlled environment. He made a garden that was designed for him to be able to paint from it. So much so that in his garden in Giverny, he had all these easels placed around the garden that he could walk to at different times of day and to study that particular lighting effect as he looked down into that particular lily pond at that particular moment. Or he could look up at that tree. As well as his lilies, he also, like, because next to water, he did lots of willow trees as well. And he did a whole series of willow tree paintings that he connected, he painted them, as he said, for the fallen in the First World War. One of his friends was Clemenceau, who was prime minister twice, I think he was, in France. He was also a big patron of Monet as well. So you had the falling of the willow trees hitting the water, and then you had these amazing water lilies coming out of the dirt and the scrub at the bottom of the pond, and then searching for the light, and they're two areas connected with each other on this flat area of the reflected water. So there was symmetry and there was balance. And another thing which the Japanese, of course, really love. Wu Wei, remember all that. So texture, simple structure here, just in amongst all this cacophony of mark and expressionistic mark of foliage, etc. We've got just a simple structure of the bridge, and again, another motif that we saw in London, going from one place to another. So there's metaphysical readings you can put into these pictures as well, though Monet never kind of emphasized that. He was all about searching for the light in nature as his eye saw it, and the combination of the two. So series is water lily series, quite large paintings which became more and more abstract. They became more and more suggestions. And when you're in front of these pictures, particularly in Paris in the Orangerie, you'd hardly make out that they're water lilies because they just look like abstract marks on a certain picture plane. So that just goes to show how his language developed. He painted so much that he was so in tune with the nature he was looking at that he just going to let these marks flow out in an abstract way. And then when you get back and stand from a distance, it all starts to make sense. Because even he worked larger and larger as well, partly because of his failing eyesight, but also he just liked the expressionistic use of the mark. But even though these marks are expressionistic, they're still working on a perspectral plane, as you can see. There's a level of recession as we go into the distance, etc. And there's a cohesion of that. But look how the marks are put on. Some emphasize the horizontal, which we know is the water on the water picture plane. And then we got the vertical here, which, it's the weeping willows reflection coming down from above as well. So it's a combination of different kinds of marks in different directions, which keeps the interest of it. Here we got the reflections of clouds on a water lily pond. A large picture again. So he's taken in the monumental here, the ever-changing light of the sky reflected in the water, in an environment which he's looking down on, into his own garden space, his own manageable domestic space, but thinking, big thinking, and the combination is just this lovely, amazing shimmering effect. Again, on top of the surface, the water lilies just sit there gently. So little you need to put in to get the impression of the reflections. Hence, you can see the name impressionism. An impression of a water lily pad, an impression of the water reflecting. tone is right, colour is right, the size of the mark is right, and then it completely envelops us when we're close to it, and when we're next and in with it. Again, different times of day, different times of year, so different coloration. Always something new. Always something new to look at. Always something new to find. And that's what we need in our own art. That thing which really ignites us, that we can kind of get excited about and keep revisiting it and getting more and more from it. The possibility in our gardens is immense, because it's relative. We can have a relatively controlled environment as well, but we can put all kinds of beautiful things in it, which can be wonderful objects for us to paint. But now we can consider where we're putting them in terms of not just how they look in the garden in relation to one plant to another, but how they lit up in the garden. How does the light affect them? Let's place plants and objects that light has a large part to play. If we're fortunate enough to be able to put a bit of water in our garden, little pond, little pool, or something like that, we open up possibilities for painting, of course, because not only do you bring in the water and the reflection of the plants around it, as we've seen, you also bring in the sky as well. So it makes a massive potential opportunity for artworks. This is an example of him in his studio. He built this incredible studio in his garden. Not many of us could do that, and it is massive. But it gives you an idea of the scale on which he was working on with these water lilies in the background there. Obviously, you need to have a sit down and have a chill out now and again on this lovely soft sofa, but amazing size and amazing kind of level of quality to them. And here they are in the orangery, this amazing overload building. You can go in and walk in and be totally wrapped around by these artworks, and you can just get absorbed in them, walk from one place to another, studying their little nuances, and then get back and see the scale and the way that our eye is working with them. Amazing.
If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell notification.